When a biased cop makes a routine arrest based on prejudice, he never expects the tables to turn in the courtroom. But what happens when the person he tried to humiliate stands as a powerful force of justice? How will this confrontation reshape his life and challenge his beliefs? Before we dive into this riveting story of redemption and justice, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales that challenge the status quo. You think you're untouchable just because you drive a fancy car? Officer Ben Carter's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Elise Bryant kept her hands on the steering wheel, her expression unreadable as she watched his face harden, the faint smirk of authority and something darker playing at the corner of his lips. "License and registration, now," he demanded, though she'd already handed it over minutes earlier. He held her documents in one hand, flipping through them like he was looking for an excuse, a crack, anything to justify the narrative he had already built in his mind. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elise asked, her voice calm, controlled, too calm for Ben's liking. She didn't sound scared. Most people he stopped, especially ones like her, had that mix of fear and desperation in their voices. But this woman? No, she wasn't playing along. "You're driving a car that's worth more than most people's houses. That's problem enough," Ben shot back, folding his arms. "Step out of the vehicle." Elise didn't move immediately, her eyes locking onto his. "May I ask why? I've complied with your requests. My license is valid, and the car is registered in my name. What exactly am I being detained for?" Ben felt the heat rise in his chest. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not like this. There was something about her tailored outfit, her confident posture, that got under his skin. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he snapped. Still, she didn't move. "Am I under arrest?" she pressed, tilting her head slightly. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't submissive either. It was measured, like she knew exactly what she was doing. Ben clenched his jaw. Yes, you are." He reached for the door handle, and before she could object further, he yanked it open. Elise stepped out, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving his face. She was taller than he expected, standing straight in her heels. She glanced briefly at the dash cam on his patrol car, then back at him. "This a mistake," she said simply. Ben ignored her. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." He pulled out his handcuffs, his fingers itching with the satisfaction of control. Elise complied, her composure unwavering as the cold steel closed around her wrists. "You don't know who I am, do you?" she said softly as he led her to the patrol car. "Does it matter?" Ben scoffed, pushing her into the back seat. He slammed the door shut, then leaned against the car for a moment, exhaling sharply. This wasn't supposed to bother him, but something about her words lingered. At the station, Elise sat in the holding cell, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and the faint smell of stale coffee hung in the air. Ben stood across the room, watching her through the glass, a mixture of irritation and confusion bubbling in his chest. He didn't like how composed she was. People weren't supposed to look like that after being cuffed and brought in. They were supposed to look defeated, rattled. But Elise Bryant sat there like she was waiting for a delayed flight at the airport. "Who is she?" Ben muttered under his breath as he walked back to his desk. He flipped through her file again. Elise Bryant. No criminal record, a pristine driving history. A quick glance at the address showed a home in an affluent neighborhood. He frowned, feeling the first prickle of doubt. "Ben!" His partner, Officer Ramirez, called from across the room. "You sure about this one? I ran her plates. Everything checks out. This might not look great." Ben bristled. She was being uncooperative. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "Uncooperative, huh? She looks like she's running for office. Maybe let her lawyer handle it before this blows up in your face." Ben waved him off. "I've got it under control." But as he sat back down, Elise's words echoed in his mind. "You don't know who I am." The next morning, Ben arrived at court, still convinced he'd handled the situation by the book. He walked into the courtroom with confidence, expecting a quick hearing. Elise would plead guilty, pay a fine, and that would be the end of it. But as he stepped through the double doors, the hum of murmured voices greeted him. Something was off. People were whispering, stealing glances at him. His stomach tightened. At the front of the courtroom, Elise stood, no longer in the simple outfit she'd been wearing the day before. She was dressed in a sharp navy suit, her hair neatly pulled back. She looked like she belonged there, not as a defendant, but as someone who commanded the room. "What the hell?" Ben muttered under his breath. "Your Honor," Elise said, her voice carrying through the room with precision and authority. "Before we proceed, I'd like to state for the record that I am a federal prosecutor, and I will be representing myself in this matter." Ben froze. The air seemed to leave the room. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Mrs. Bryant, this is highly irregular." Elise smiled faintly. "Yes, Your Honor. But given the circumstances of my arrest, I feel it's necessary to personally address the allegations and the officer's conduct." Ben's heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. This wasn't going to be routine. This was a nightmare. Elise turned slightly, her eyes meeting Ben's from across the room. For the first time, he saw something flicker in her gaze. Something he couldn't place. It wasn't anger or smugness. It was colder than that. Purposeful. "You've made a big mistake, Officer Carter," she said, her voice steady. "And today we're going to talk about it." The courtroom fell silent, every eye on Ben, as the weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. Elise Bryant stood tall, her commanding voice resonating in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I intend to argue not only my innocence, but to address a pattern of abuse within law enforcement that this officer's actions represent. I request this case be given the weight it deserves." The murmurs in the room grew louder. Officer Ben Carter sat frozen at the defendant's table, his usual confidence cracking. The courtroom felt like it was closing in on him. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like Elise, calm, composed, professional, didn't belong in a holding cell. And they certainly didn't end up dismantling his actions in front of a judge. "Mrs. Bryant, I'll allow you to proceed," the judge said, her tone carrying a mix of curiosity and caution. "But I expect your arguments to remain relevant to the charges at hand." Elise nodded, turning back to the gallery. The room was packed. Journalists, local activists, and a growing number of curious onlookers who had caught wind of the unusual proceedings. Elise's presence commanded the space, and Ben could feel the weight of judgment in every eye that landed on him. Elise began her case with the poise of someone who had lived in courtrooms for years. She detailed her arrest, sticking to the facts, but making each word hit like a hammer. "I was stopped with no clear reason provided," Elise said, glancing briefly at Ben. "Despite presenting valid identification and cooperating fully, I was accused of resisting authority, a charge that's often used as a catch-all when no real crime has been committed. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a systemic issue." Ben shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Every word felt like a dart aimed directly at his chest. He wanted to defend himself, but his attorney had warned him to stay quiet. Speaking out now would only make things worse. Elise walked toward the jury box, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Your Honor, I have years of experience prosecuting cases like this. I've seen how power can be abused, and I've fought against it. But yesterday, I became the target of that abuse. And today I stand here not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been on the receiving end of unwarranted profile." Her words landed heavily, and for the first time, Ben began to feel something other than frustration or anger. There was a gnawing sensation in his chest, something dangerously close to guilt. As Elise presented her evidence, she displayed a quiet ruthlessness. She called on witnesses, people who had been in the courtroom during Ben's previous cases. One after another, they recounted incidents where Ben had overstepped his authority, his actions rooted more in prejudice than in justice. A young black man in his 20s took the stand. "Officer Carter pulled me over last year," he said, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "He said my taillight was out, but it wasn't. Then he searched my car without asking. When I questioned him, he said, 'People like you are always hiding something.'" Ben's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to justify his actions, but there was no outlet. His attorney leaned over and whispered, "Keep your head down. It's better this way." During a recess, Ben sat alone in a corner of the hallway, his head in his hands. Ramirez approached cautiously, sitting down beside him. "How bad is it looking?" Ben asked without lifting his head. Ramirez hesitated. "It's not good, man. She's tearing you apart in there, and she's got receipts, reports, witness statements, body cam footage. It's all stacked against you." Ben exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. Ramirez gave him a long, hard look. "Didn't you, though? Look, Ben, I've backed you up more times than I can count, but maybe it's time to take a step back and think about why this keeps happening." Ben finally looked up, his eyes meeting Ramirez's. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's not just about this one case. Maybe it's about the way you see people, like Elise Bryant. You didn't see her as a person when you stopped her, did you? You saw something else." Ben didn't answer. He couldn't. Back in the courtroom, Elise brought the tension to its peak. She played the footage from Ben's dashcam, showing her calm demeanor throughout the interaction. The contrast between her professionalism and Ben's aggression was stark. The final blow came when Elise addressed the court directly. "This case isn't just about me. It's about the culture that allows officers to act with impunity, especially toward people of color. Officer Carter isn't an anomaly. He's a symptom of a larger problem. And if we don't address it, we are complicit in allowing it to continue." Ben felt the eyes of the gallery burn into him, a collective weight of judgment pressing down. Elise's words were a mirror, forcing him to see himself in a way he never had before. He thought about all the times he'd stopped someone based on a gut feeling, the subtle biases that had driven his decisions. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. The climax of the case came when the judge called for closing statements. Elise's voice was steady, her gaze unwavering as she delivered her final argument. "I don't stand here today to seek vengeance," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "I stand here to demand accountability, to demand that we do better, not just as individuals, but as a society. Officer Carter's actions weren't just about me. They were about every person who has ever been made to feel less than simply because of the color of their skin. We have to be better than this." The room erupted in applause as she finished, the tension finally breaking. Ben sat motionless, his mind racing. He knew his fate now rested in the judge's hands, but in his heart, he already felt the scales tipping. The judge called for a brief recess, and the gallery buzzed with anticipation. Ben stared at Elise as she stood by the prosecution table, her back straight and her expression calm. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had fought for something much bigger, and Ben couldn't ignore the growing realization that maybe she was right. The courtroom was quieter now, the energy subdued but heavy with anticipation. Judge Morrison returned to her bench, her face grave as she shuffled through the stack of evidence and testimony presented. She cleared her throat, the sound echoing in the still room. "After reviewing the arguments and evidence, it's clear that this case goes beyond a single traffic stop. It highlights broader issues of systemic bias and misconduct within law enforcement," she began, her tone steady but piercing. "Officer Carter, this court will refer your actions to the Department's Internal Affairs for a full investigation. Additionally, I recommend mandatory bias training for not just you, but the entire precinct." The words landed like a gavel strike, final and unforgiving. Ben Carter sat still, his face pale and unreadable, as the murmurs rippled through the gallery. "For Miss Bryant," Judge Morrison continued, her voice softening slightly, "I commend your courage and professionalism in bringing these issues to light. You've handled this matter with grace, and I hope it serves as a catalyst for meaningful change." After the verdict, the courthouse lobby filled with a blend of relief and tension. Reporters buzzed around Elise Bryant, microphones thrust toward her as cameras clicked rapidly. Elise remained poised, answering questions with her signature composure. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "It's about accountability and ensuring the systems meant to protect us serve everyone equally. I'm grateful the court took this matter seriously, but this is just the beginning." Ben watched from a distance, his stomach churning. Ramirez stood beside him, arms folded, his expression unreadable. "You've got a long road ahead, Ben," Ramirez said finally. "You can't keep running from this." Ben swallowed hard. He didn't have a response. Instead, he took a deep breath and began walking toward Elise. She spotted him before he reached her, her eyes narrowing slightly, her guard rising. "Elise," he said awkwardly, his voice quieter than usual. "Can I have a word?" The reporters looked on with interest, but Elise raised a hand, signaling them to hold back. She nodded, stepping a few feet away from the crowd to give them some privacy. "What is it, Officer Carter?" she asked, her tone clipped but professional. Ben hesitated, searching for the right words. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Elise tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Sorry for what?" Ben's face flushed. "For everything. For how I treated you, for making assumptions, for—" He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "For being part of the problem." Elise studied him for a long moment, her arms crossed. "Do you even understand what you're apologizing for, or are you just trying to save face?" Her words stung, but Ben nodded. "I'm starting to. I know I have a lot to learn. A lot to unlearn, actually." The tension between them hung in the air, thick and unyielding. Finally, Elise sighed. "Apologies are a start, Officer Carter, but they don't mean much without action. Change isn't just about saying you're sorry. It's about proving it." "I will," Ben said earnestly. "I know I've got work to do, and I'm not expecting you to believe me right now, but I will." Elise didn't respond immediately. Instead, she nodded slightly and walked away, leaving Ben standing there, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Weeks later, Ben sat in the small community center downtown, surrounded by people he would have never interacted with before. The chairs were arranged in a circle, and the facilitator, a young black woman named Maya, smiled warmly at the group. "Welcome to the first session of our anti-bias training," she began. "This is a space for reflection, growth, and accountability. Let's start by introducing ourselves and sharing why we're here." Ben's turn came quickly, and he felt the eyes of the group on him. He cleared his throat. "I'm Ben Carter. I'm a police officer, and I'm here because I made a lot of mistakes. I've hurt people, and I need to figure out how to fix that." The room was silent for a moment before Maya nodded. "Thank you for your honesty, Ben. Acknowledging the problem is the first step." Meanwhile, Elise continued her work, using her newfound platform to advocate for police reform. Her speeches at public forums and interviews on national news channels drew attention to systemic issues and proposed tangible solutions. She became a beacon of hope for many, though she remained acutely aware of how much work lay ahead. One evening, after a particularly exhausting meeting with a community advocacy group, Elise received a letter in her office mailbox. It was from Ben. She hesitated before opening it, unsure if she wanted to know what he had to say. Inside, the handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "Elise, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that your words didn't fall on deaf ears. I've started attending anti-bias training, and I'm working with community leaders to understand the harm I've caused. I know it's not enough, but I'm trying. Thank you for holding me accountable. You didn't have to, but you did, and it's made me see things I should have seen long ago." Ben Carter. Elise folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't know how to feel. Relieved, perhaps, that he seemed to be making an effort, but cautious. Change didn't happen overnight, and one man's journey was just a small piece of the puzzle. Months turned into a year, and the ripples of Elise's case continued to spread. The police department implemented new training protocols, and a civilian oversight committee was formed to address misconduct. While progress was slow, it was progress. At the end of a long day, Elise stood on the courthouse steps, the city skyline glowing behind her. She glanced down at her phone, scrolling through an email update from a local advocacy group. A faint smile touched her lips. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. Across the city, Ben stood in front of a community mural painted on the side of the precinct building, a vibrant depiction of justice, unity, and hope. He traced the lines of the artwork with his eyes, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He wasn't the same man who had stood in that courtroom months ago. He didn't know if he'd ever fully make amends for his past, but he was determined to spend the rest of his life trying. As the sun dipped below the horizon, two very different people reflected on the paths that had brought them to this moment. Elise and Ben, once adversaries in a courtroom, were now bound by an unspoken understanding that justice wasn't a destination but a journey, one they were both still walking.